So today we're taking a look at the smaller, I guess you can say mid-sized Royal Oak model. I believe it's the 15450 off the top of my head. Pretty interesting model, and let's take a closer look. So we have a diameter of 37 millimeters, lug to lug of 53.8, real lug to lug realistically at 46, estimated height of about 9.7, and although it's integrated, the bracelet tapers from about 23 to 16 millimeters. So some other general specifications here, we're going to have the caliber 3120 in-house movement beating away in here. Pretty nicely finished. We do have the 22 karat gold rotor there, which we'll zoom in on later. Other than that, we do have 50 meters of stated water resistance with a screw down crown, so probably true 50 meters. And then we do have Lume on the hands and the indices. And last but not least, the watch retails from AP for $24,100. So starting off the dial here, we do have the classic AP Grand Tapisserie dial. It is a bunch of very geometric squares with a type of swirly, concentric type circle graining going around the entire dial itself. Zooming in later, we'll be able to appreciate it a little bit more. Looking a little bit more generally, we do have baton style hour and minute hands. We do have baton indices everywhere except the 3 for the date and 12 where we have the double baton. The hands and indices are all made of white gold, so that is a nice touch. The text on the watch is kept very, very minimal. We just have the AP logo, AP written out just below that, automatic and Swiss made at the very, very bottom here at 6 o'clock. So they kept the text very minimal, very subtle, and thankfully no frivolous text they didn't really need. Speaking on the dial very quickly, we do have I believe they call it a silver dial, and it very much is so. It's not quite white, it's not quite super sunbursty silver. It is a very nice gentle sunburst effect, especially broken up by the tapisserie style dial. That's not too aggressive. It is very subtle. It's one of those dials that definitely is more chameleon-like. In some lights it can look almost white, and other lights it definitely needs a lot more silver. So it is nice that you have that variety and that kind of duality to the color. Other than that, not much else to say about the dial. I do think it's well done. It's very simple, it's very clean, it's very symmetric. And honestly, the dial definitely does come to life, one, more in direct sunlight, and two, when we zoom in a little closer. So looking at the watch in natural light, you can see it takes on this very monotone color and this kind of shaded light. It becomes very silvery white, kind of leaning silver, but at off angles it goes more silver. It becomes a little bit more sunbursty, relatively dynamic. You can see in more direct light, the dial goes a little bit whiter, a little bit more silver at those off angles still, but the sunburst comes out maybe slightly a bit more, and of course the bracelet becomes slightly grayer. Even from this further away distance, you can kind of just see how much the watch pops. The dial kind of does take a backseat, and the finishing of the bracelet going from light to dark, the finishing of the bezel going from light to dark, that black polish really on full display here and done really well. Even at an angle like this, you can see a lot of the bracelet's blackish, and then at other angles it goes really silver, like here in more kind of shaded light. It's one of those watches which really comes to life when you take it outside and let that finishing really speak for itself. So zooming in here, we do see the dial takes on a lot more life up close. In some respects, I do find it a little bit underwhelming because it is such a subtle texture that's so hard to see, but it's also something to be appreciated because it is hard to do it this fine, this uniform, and this well done. One thing I do like is it is somewhat easier to see in direct light, but again, I do think if they kind of expanded the texture and made it a little bit more visible from wrist, that would be a really nice touch. The base dial itself is actually like very, very small indented holes all throughout the dial, which have this very interesting effect. They catch the light and they definitely catch your eye. And then of course we have all these squares that holds that more striated circular pattern. You can see that texture is perfectly continued into the AP lettering, or at least the platform that the AP lettering is on. It is all very nicely done. You can even see, looking at the white gold markers, they are multifaceted. You have the very, very flat, broad top facet and the 2 facets on the side. And thankfully the marker does look very well finished. White gold can be a little softer, so sometimes it is hard to work with, but thankfully it is done to a very good standard here. The lume itself too is applied very finely, very evenly. I don't see any kind of fibrousness to the lume at all. It does give off a very premium feel because of that, and it doesn't feel like any corner was cut. One thing I like about the applied elements on the dial is you have these kind of rounded off rectangular indices, and as well as the hands, that kind of flow at odds and also in harmony with the watch itself. The Royal Oak has a very aggressive, very geometric bracelet, geometric bezel, of course, but there also is a rounded nature to it, roundedness on the side of the bezel, roundedness in the links, and this is kind of mirrored in the dial and the roundedness of the hands themselves. But you have that contrast against the square, harsh geometricness of the dial pattern, so you do have a lot of continuity of design here. Taking a look at the hands, you can see they are pretty much blemish free. You have this very, very clean hour hand that's bifaceted. The minutes hand, it has that same feature to it. And I also really like how the lume is very, very recessed on the hands. It just gives a really nice look, a nice three-dimensionality to what would otherwise be a very kind of 2D-ish looking design. And it's also really nice to see there really aren't many QC issues here. The only thing I've spotted is there's this tiny, tiny speck here on the counterbalance of the second hand. But outside of that, the watch is pretty much perfectly finished. There isn't really anything else that stands out. There isn't anything that seems like it shouldn't be there. And there was really a lot of attention paid to this dial, and it does show. Looking at the date window, we see we have this more kind of gray metallic date disc with black numerals. It does stand a little bit at odds with the coloration of the dial. It's not quite the same silver, but I guess that's kind of for legibility purposes, so you can actually read the date fairly easily. But as it stands, it's done well, finished nicely, and really no complaints there. The text here has a really nice inkiness to it, a nice three-dimensionality as well. AP logo is very nicely polished, very reflective. So at the end of the day, it's a really well done dial, and there really isn't any QC issue I see other than a tiny little blemish on the seconds hand. And really, it's not really make or break. It is still very, very nicely finished. So moving on to the case of this watch, and this is what pretty much makes it the icon that it is. It is the Royal Oak case. You have that octagonal bezel, you have this very stylized integrated bracelet with these square-ish links. It is pretty much one of the best integrated sports watch stylings, and it is so for a reason. Looking at the finishing, we do have a very, very fine brushed finishing on the top surface of the watch, pretty much everywhere. And then you have polished highlights, you have a polished chamfer along the edge side of the case here, which is nice because it thins out towards the middle of the case and thickens out towards the edge here where the bracelet goes. And it actually continues perfectly along the exact same line, exact same curve along the bracelet. So there's a really, really nice continuation of that design language there. The top of the bezel is fully brushed, but the slanted side has a high polish to it. Very nice accent from dead on. It doesn't really pop out at you overly, but as you move it even a tiny bit, that really does come to life. It does shine, it does pop at you. So for a watch that is mainly brushed, it has a lot of flash to it. It has a lot of shine. It has a lot of just light play. Looking at the side of the case, again, very simple, all fully brushed horizontally. You can see this is really a three-piece case with the mid case, the bezel, which is very defined and on top, and the case back itself. The case back is fairly thin. There's not really a lot of curvature to the mid case, so it is a fairly flat wearing watch. But thankfully, especially if you get the right size for you, as the 37 is for me, it wears pretty well on wrist. Looking at the case back really quick, you have these very heavy duty screws, Royal Oak at the top, Serio at the bottom, and of course the very nicely decorated movement, which we'll zoom in on a little bit later. Looking at the bottom of the bracelet, you can see everything is very level, it is very smooth, it does feel very nice against the wrist. The edges of the bracelet, by contrast, can be a little sharp. At times I wish those were a little bit more rounded just for comfort, but that's a very small point. Looking at the top of the bracelet, the same remains true. It is very flat, it is very integrated, it's very much one piece, and it's very surprisingly thin for what is considered, you know, a sports watch, but it has very much an elegance to it. One thing again is we do have mainly a brushed finish here. You have vertical brushing here along every top side of the lugs, and you have only very slight polish finishing at the very ends of these kind of pill mid-links, I guess you could say. And it's a very interesting effect because as the watch does move, it does kind of bend, you do get a lot of interesting light play. And surprisingly, you get a lot of light play just from the brushing itself. Usually you don't see brushing kind of react this aggressively, this interestingly, but it is done very finely and it does catch the light very nicely because you have such small, intricate bracelet links. It is by no means the only watch to ever do this, but it is a watch that kind of pioneered the idea and it executes it very, very well. Moving on to the clasp, you can see we have a push button butterfly deployant. Closing it up, it feels very sturdy, and then you do have the AP logo kind of blindly done in there. Feels very nice, integrates very well, looks pretty nice. At the end of the day, a butterfly deployant is a butterfly deployant. If you like them, you like them. If you don't, you don't. I'm kind of in the camp that doesn't like them because sometimes you can't get a perfect fit and you don't have micro adjust and all that good stuff. One interesting thing about the Royal Oak as well is it has the same size link all the way through. It is screw links, which is nice, but it is the same size all the way through. So for some, you can maybe not get the perfect fit. You might have to wear it slightly tight or slightly loose. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then just taking a look at that angle really quick, just to appreciate the fact that it's a beautifully engineered bracelet. It looks great. Again, it plays with the light amazingly well, and it just is a beauty to look at. And one interesting thing to note about the AP bracelet is you can see it has this like link system or screw system where it's just a tiny little screw in this kind of retaining bar that fits in to the edge of the bracelet. You can see kind of pokes out on the other end. It is flush, but it's interesting to see because it's not a fully integrated screw. It's not one screw that's all in one piece. It's this kind of bar and then screw that kind of holds it together system, which is I haven't seen before, but obviously they probably use it for a reason, whether that's to keep it thin or just they found that's the most stable. I don't know. One thing about the crown I will note is while the bezel is octagonal, the crown is hexagonal, and it's like a lug nut, you know, it has this very interesting knurling to it. It isn't the most pleasant feeling against your fingers, but that comes with the industrial design. It does work well with the overall design, but I don't know if they added more, you know, facets, more sides, if it would be more comfortable or not, but there may be something, or maybe if they rounded it slightly, but maybe that would destroy the design language, so what do I know? The winding experience on the AP is very, very nice. You get a very, very clicky, definitive click back. It isn't too loud, it isn't too screechy, it's just nice, buttery, smooth, and it is really pleasurable to wind for an automatic movement. Setting the time is equally smooth. I feel like because the crown feels a little bit weird to manipulate, it does hinder the feeling of the time setting of the watch, but very, very minor thing. At the end of the day, the watch is more about design than, I guess, comfort. Moving on to the movement of the watch, it is obviously very well done. You do again have this 22 karat gold rotor that has the family crest of the Audemars and the Piguet families, and it just looks really, really well done. You do, of course, have the Geneva striping, some gold lettering, some gold gears on display, a full balance bridge, which obviously helps the stability of the movement, the balance wheel beating away there. I would say the rotor does obviously take up a lot of the movement, so you can't see a lot of things on display at first, but at the end of the day, one, at least it is a pretty good looking rotor, and two, the movement you can't really see much of anyway. You just see very big bridges. Of course, it is very nicely finished, but you can't see much of the internals themselves. Moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing my Piguet Tradition here. This is about a 38mm case. You can see it in comparison to the 37 Royal Oak. It will obviously feel a little bit bigger because of the integration, but let's take a look. And there we have the Royal Oak sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist. What's really nice, again, as you can see as I just kind of move it around the light, is there is a lot of shine and shimmer and just light play to the watch itself. You get areas of the watch that go black and darker and more kind of gunmetal gray, than other parts that get very bright and very silvery and very just shiny looking, depending on the light and how much light you have flowing onto the watch itself. So it really is a like living, changing, organic type of metal look. Overall, I think the size is pretty great. I wouldn't mind also trying on the 34 just because I do like smaller watches, but the 37 definitely is a nice kind of sportier look. It isn't too large, it isn't too small. It definitely could be an everyday watch, a dress watch, whatever I really need it to be. It has the water resistance to kind of be whatever you want, and has the thinness and the dressiness and the shininess to be a dress watch. Looking at the watch kind of down the barrel there, you can see it sits very flatly on wrist. Again, you just have to get a size that's right for you, because if I went for, let's say, the 41, because it's fairly flat, because the sides of the bracelet aren't that curved, it will definitely dig into my wrist and not feel very comfortable. So at the end of the day, pick one that fits you right, and let's also hope the bracelet fits you right. And here we have a nice little wrist roll just for the little bit of light play you get. That is pretty awesome. And looking at the watch from the side there, although it's not the most ergonomic and flat case, it does still sit very, very nice onto the wrist. It's not too slab-sided, mainly because it's not too thick and the case back isn't too bulky either. So it is a very nice wearing watch. I'm glad about the thinness of this watch as well. If this was, let's say, 12mm thick, it'd be a little bit of a different story. It wouldn't feel as good, it wouldn't feel as premium. But I guess that's also why you paid, you know, $20,000, because, I mean, you know, depending on the market, of course, you're probably spending more $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. But that aside, you're paying for that refinement. You're paying for that kind of feel of premium and quality on the wrist. Crown, because it has these very definitive sides to it, because it is hexagonal, it does dig into the wrist at certain angles depending on how high you wear your watch. It does dig a little bit into my wrist. It isn't the most comfortable crown, so this is just something to keep note of. The butterfly deployant clasps too, the edges of the bracelet here kind of on the actual deployant system aren't the smoothest and not the most rounded, so that too, if you wear the watch too tight, can dig a little bit and feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially, let's say, if it's a little bit loose and then it gets hot and it's too tight. So although this is, you know, meant to be a very geometric watch with harsh lines and harsh angles, I do think there are some points where it needs to stop resting on its laurels a little bit and have a little bit more refinement and just a little bit of things that would help the end user experience, because at the end of the day, it isn't just a beautifully designed watch, it's a watch meant to be worn on a wrist. So taking a look at the Lume here, we can see it is relatively well done. We do have all the hands and the indices fully glowing. They all glow at the same temperature. There isn't areas that are darker or brighter than others, so it is very uniform, which is nice to see. But overall, it really isn't the brightest application. I would have expected a little bit more, especially at this price point. You can definitely, spring for a couple extra layers on the dial. So I do think this is one area where AP can improve. So reluming and comparing to the Timex, we can see here, obviously, they both glow fairly well. They're both legible, but the Timex is obviously much brighter, a little bit bluer as well, a little bit more legible. So the AP can definitely do a little bit better job and be just a little bit brighter, honestly. So pros and cons of the Royal Oak. And for me, at least in my opinion, this is the best size for my wrist. So I believe if you have probably around a 6.75, maybe pushing it up to a 7-inch wrist and below, this is gonna be a really nice size for you. If you're around a 7-inch wrist and up, you might wanna look at the Jumbo 39 or even the 41, just depending on your preference. But I believe for the smaller-ish wristed people, this is an amazing size. The proportions are very nice. It makes it feel a little bit dressier than the overly sporty, bigger models, and it just fits very well. I like the idea as well of the Royal Oak being slightly smaller just because it makes all the dressy, shiny elements of the watch, in a sense, make more sense, because it is a very dressy looking sports watch compared to anything else. If you put this side by side with, let's say, a Submariner, the Submariner is much more of a tool watch than this is a tool watch, even though it's kind of supposed to be built that way as an everyday stainless steel piece. So it's one of those things where if you can go for the smaller size, I would say do it. Another big pro for this watch, in my opinion, is the finishing of the bracelet. That brushing, the way it's done, the accents of the high polish, it feels very premium and it just shines amazingly well and catches the light amazingly well for being a fully brushed surface. Usually if you're thinking brushed watches, you're thinking something more tooly, you're thinking something that's a little bit more under the radar. But despite those like preconceptions, when you wear this watch, it is like a disco ball on the wrist. Any way you move it, because how small the links are, how finely brushed it is, it just pops. It's intense. It's a lot on the wrist. It's not something that's subtle by any means. So it's a very surprising thing, because you can maybe, by looking at the watch on the website or whatnot, it doesn't seem like it's going to shine or pop or stand out much in person, but it really does. And I think that's an aspect of this watch that makes it feel very premium and makes it feel very different from other watches on the market. And lastly, a big pro for this watch, I guess, not necessarily this exact model, but the Royal Oak line in general, is that it's iconic. There's no way around that. It is one of the better designs, if not one of the best designs in watchmaking. It's something that undoubtedly changed watchmaking, or at least the watch wearing, the watch collecting landscape as a whole. And it's brought us the idea of the modern stainless steel sports watch. It's something that's insanely influential as just a design and as maybe like an art piece in a sense. So I could even see there's people who maybe don't even collect this to wear. They collect it to have a part of watch history in a sense, which is a little esoteric of an idea, but as it stands, again, this design is amazingly well done. It's amazingly well executed, and it deserves the praise it gets. So moving on to cons, and while this watch is great, it's not everything. I think one of the bigger cons for me personally is the dial, at least on this specific model. I have seen the new, I believe it's 15550, and I've seen the gray version of that, and if I had to pick between the two, I'd go with the gray version all day long. That kind of monochromatic, very monotone nature to it that pops with the bracelet but doesn't pop with the dial, to me makes sense more. To me, this watch is much more about the outer structure than it is the inner structure of the movement or the inner structure of the dial. It's very much bracelet first and case first. So it's something that I don't think the dial should be drawing any attention away. And for me, not only because this is a brighter dial in a sense, but also because of the way the sunburst pattern is, to me it doesn't complement, it doesn't feel like it fits well. I'm sure some people might like it because in a sense it does contrast from the bracelet, not only for legibility purposes, but again, you get that nice steel monochrome tooly look from the bracelet, and then you get that nice pop of color with a dial. So I'm sure it's for some people, it's just not for me. It's not my preferred styling, and I don't think it perfectly fits the Royal Oak. Continuing on with why I don't like the dial, one of those aspects of the watch where I think it falls a little bit flat. There's a lot of reflectiveness from the bracelet, there's a lot of shine in the bracelet, and in just the overall appearance of the watch in a sense. The dial to me is a slight bit of a letdown. Again, if it was super subtle and super under the radar, I'd be fine, but it almost tries not to be, but it doesn't do it well. The way that the sunbursty pattern comes out, it's not too aggressive or not too bright or not too noticeable, which I like in some aspects, but here it feels like they only went a halfway point with it. But more realistically, what I really don't enjoy about this dial is the fact that the texture is very small. It's something that I'm not really, it's not very forward, it's not something that's very apparent, and it's hard to see the depth and the intricacy of the pattern, which of course you can see with a loop, but I don't walk with a loop on my face. I can't really see the pattern from arm's length, and I don't really know it's there in a sense. So it would be nice to maybe have a larger, more defined, more immediately visible tapisserie pattern. And I know this is the very traditional way of doing the dial, but tradition can be changed, you know? Just because it was done before doesn't mean it's the perfect version for now. So this is one aspect where I think the dial can be changed slightly and, in my opinion, benefit the watch. In a perfect world, it'd be a very dark dial with a defined enough pattern to where at some angles you can kind of see it, but it doesn't detract immediately from the bracelet or the wearing experience. It just complements and adds a nice little layer to it. And lastly, my bigger con with the watch is, to me, the wearing experience just isn't comfortable. The bracelet can be sharp, the clasp can be a little bit sharp. It's one of those things where, of course, from the top view, it's very angular, it's sharp, it's precise. But from the bottom, it's not something you see from the top. The bottom of the bracelet's on the wrist and it's not exposed, and it's, in my opinion, not something that would ruin the fine edges and sharpness of the watch. That's something that can be a little bit more rounded and a little bit more geared towards comfort. You can be very square on the top and a little bit more softened on the bottom. Kind of following from some of my earlier points, it almost is like an art piece. It's more form than it is function. It's not something that, to me, works perfectly on the wrist. I've heard stories about people with more arm hair having it be very much of a hair puller of a bracelet, but I haven't had any issues with that. It's just the fact that at times it can be uncomfortable. At times it can feel sharp. It's a problem that I think can be remedied pretty easily, but whether or not AP will take that step, I don't know. So final thoughts on this watch, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. I've never found a Royal Oak which, in my opinion, fit me right, I think looked that good in person, or kind of lived up to my expectations in a sense. Again, this is an icon, this is a part of the Holy Trinity, this is one of the watches people dream of owning, and to me it never felt like that. I've tried on the Jumbo, I've reviewed the Jumbo, I've tried on the 41mm Royal Oak, I tried on the chronographs, I've tried on the 38mm chronograph. Nothing overly grabbed me and said, yes, this is it. This is something I want, or something that I appreciate in a sense. But then after wearing this 37, it being, in my opinion, the right size for me, the experience changed. I liked wearing the watch. I enjoyed the wearing experience. I loved the light play of the bracelet, which is obviously something that you can't necessarily appreciate until you own it a little bit or you spend some extended time with it. And some of the elements which didn't immediately pop out to me before, I didn't appreciate before in the larger sizes, came together and really felt good at this size in this watch. So it turns someone who is typically a dress watch person, who doesn't like sports watches, who usually hates almost every integrated sports watch, into somebody who almost wants this watch and wants a Royal Oak at some point. So I think that says a lot. Undoubtedly, they got the design right on this one. It is beautiful in person, and you just have to find, in a sense, the right one for you. And I believe there probably is the right one or a right version for every person. The only problem with AP and Royal Oaks in general is it's hard to see them in person, so it might be hard to find which one you like the most. So maybe that will change in the next coming years, who knows? But as it stands, I think at the end of the day, if you love this watch, you'll probably really like it in person. If you like this watch, you'll probably find a version for you, and if you hate this watch, you may come around to it if you find that right one for you. Is it a perfect watch? No. There's still aspects of it where, even if I was given this watch for free, which sounds insane, I probably wouldn't wear it all the time, or I don't even know how much I would wear it, because again, to me, it's not the most comfortable watch, and it's a little flashy, and you don't want that all the time. So there's aspects of the watch that I think can be improved, and we'll see whether or not those improvements come in the future. Anyway, those were just my thoughts. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.